friends. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about weaponized compassion. Let me start by telling you a story. I was raised in Omaha, Nebraska, a conservative area to start with, and I was in a very conservative, extremely religious family. My father was a traveling minister, an evangelist, and all we did is go to church 5 times a week. And we had no friends of the family that were not associated with this little church that we went to. That was very conservative. Everybody else was going to hell. They were the only ones that were going to go to heaven because they knew what the truth was, and everybody else didn't. The environment that I grew up with, my family, my extended family, were all Republicans. And that was not obvious to me because this was not an in-your-face kind of thing where they talked about politics around the dinner table or Christmas or anything like that when the family all got together. Not at all. But I do remember that my grandfather was very active in Republican things and went to meetings and stuff, but he really never talked about it. So it was just not a major thing in my life. All of our major elected officials, both of our senators were Republicans. It was just the way it was, and it was not much of interest to me. I went off to the Navy. I went to a Christian college, okay, down in Arkansas. And of course, they're all Republicans. And they very conservative. You had to do everything right. It was all just a extension of your home. I mean, you could literally get thrown out of this place if you didn't make your bed enough times. And which I didn't, and I did. I got thrown out 3 times in college. So when I went off into the Navy, when I graduated from college in January of 1966, I again was in a kind of a conservative environment because the military is, I found out later I was one of very few Democrats that were in the military, and it was kind of an evolutionary thing. And it was, and the way it happened was kind of interesting because I remember the first break, and it was in the kind of presumed given narrative that I had grown up with, and it happened in college when I was Jesse Jackson was just making a name for himself, and he was on the news one time, and he said, I don't think all the people in China are going to hell because some white missionary didn't go over there and talk to them. I said, that makes sense. That was, and it was such a break from the whole kind of notion that if you didn't go through this little routine, that was its central aspect of our lives, that you were, of course, going to hell, and it didn't make any difference where you were in the world. If you hadn't gone through our little routine, you weren't going to make it. So it was I started for the first time to see that there was an alternative to what I'd been drilled into my head over and over again from so many directions with so many experiences. As a matter of fact, I really I don't think I voted until after I got out of the Navy. And I joined the Navy. I remember my brother asked me, why in the world would you join the military? And I said, because I feel it's an obligation. The country's done well for me, and you have a duty to kind of give back to society. And I had bought into that whole kind of notion. And when I got to Vietnam, it was, the whole narrative there. And the argument was that the domino theory. And if we lost Vietnam, all the rest of Asia would go away and be sucked up by the communists. And seemed okay to me. I mean, it seemed reasonable to me. But really didn't think much about it. And but I remember that what I used to do uniquely, I think, among everybody that was in the air wing on an aircraft carrier, there's a ship's company that runs the ship. And then there's the air wing, which is all the squadrons and the airplanes and the squadrons that come out on and live on the ship for 6 months, and then they go away. And the ship's company keeps running the ship around and doing whatever they do. And so I was in the air wing, and every time, and we'd have to brief down in the intelligence spaces before we'd go off on a mission. And when we'd come back, we'd debrief in the intelligence spaces on the carrier. And there was on a clipboard hanging on the wall. They don't call them walls on ships, but it's a wall. And there was a clipboard, which is the top secret message board. And so I would go down there every day and look and flip through all of the messages on the top secret board to just see what was going on. And I could literally see where Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor at the time, was making targeting decisions that would affect me and my friends in my air wing, because he would decide where we were going to go to start, and where the next attack was going to be, and who was perhaps going to get killed in the process. And for the first time, I understood the fallacy, the underlying structure of this whole business of war and things. And it became very clear that it was all kind of manipulated. We were not in that war to win the war at all. There was the rules of engagement said 3 things, and they made it very clear to us at the beginning. You cannot bomb the railroads going up to China, because that's where all the material was coming down from China, right? You cannot bomb the piers at Haiphong, in the harbor of Haiphong, because that's where all the stuff was coming in from the ships. And the argument was, well, there are British flagged ships that might be in there, and if you hit one, then it would cause a shoot, And the other thing was you couldn't bomb the dikes on the rice paddies, because of course, if you did that and the water all flowed out, then they wouldn't have any food, and then they'd quit the war, right? They'd stop the war. So it was fixed. It was and so for the first time, I said, wait a second, this is a racket. They're screwing with this. And my friends, some who literally got killed, who would come to me and say, John, please help. We were doing active jamming and trying to jam the missile systems that were trying to kill our guys when we go in. And they'd come and say, please help me. Tomorrow night, I'm going into this place. It's going to really be bad. And I could see how, probably unlike almost anybody else in the air wing, how that the politicians were manipulating this whole thing, and they really weren't trying to win this war. And it was a charade. It was fake. And I suddenly realized that the system was fundamentally flawed for the first time, because I had always bought into the basic kind of notion. When I got out of the Navy, then we moved to Chicago. My first jobs were in Chicago, in the Chicago area. And, if you're not a Democrat in Chicago, you're nothing, because there isn't anything else. I mean, you can count the Republicans on 2 hands, maybe, or something like that, relatively speaking. And we went to a little church. We were very active in a church that was an evangelical church, still had some of the same kind of stuff that was familiar that came from my youth, but they were very active in social engagement. I helped build legal aid clinics for poor people who couldn't do things. I helped build housing for mixed income, mixed racial housing, which was one of the first ones in Chicago, in the Chicago area. My wife did counseling with kids from out of the ghetto and so on. And so it was really in this, this strange kind of amalgam between this kind of conservative theology and this larger kind of notion that says that you need to be helpful to people, particularly people that can't help themselves for whatever reason. And that's really resonated with me very strongly because I extracted out of my youth kind of some of the principles associated with Christianity. And there were a variety of things that stay with me still. But, one of them is that you're supposed to help people that can't help themselves. I mean, it's part of compassion. It's part of, the rest of, the Boy Scout kind of things that, a scout is, I don't know. I forget them all. If I got it going, I could remember. It sounds honest and clean and truthful and trustworthy and loyal and helpful and friendly and courteous and kind and obedient, cheerful, brave, clean, and reverent. Okay, so that's that's the stuff that where I had come out of, and I believed all of those things. It all just made sense. And so when I first got into Chicago, the politics, like I say, the existing politics were all Democrat, and so I was exposed. And then I was with this church that was really trying to help people, and they weren't buying into all this Republican stuff. They were out into this, and so it was what started to show up in my life was this kind of dichotomy, or this kind of this assessment of the two sides of the political spheres. And on one hand was the Democrats, who at that time, to my way of thinking, were the ones who were helping the people who needed help. They were for the unions, and instead they had all of the kind of social system programs and other kind of things for folks that needed help. And the Republicans, on the other hand, at that time, to me, looked like just the guys who were trying to make as much money and suck as much stuff out of the system as they could. And they certainly weren't principally interested in helping poor people or those who really needed to be helped. So for my early life, for 20, 30 years almost, maybe, I was a Democrat. And I was a Democrat, because I had thought about it and I looked out and I saw what they were doing and I saw what the Republicans were doing, and I decided that they were the closest to my values about helping people, and particularly helping those that couldn't help themselves. And I lived in Chicago, and I'll tell you, living in the inner city or near the inner city and in the city and near the inner city of Chicago was a very illuminating experience, because what you found out if you were engaged, I mean, you could live in Chicago and not really figure this out for sure, or certainly live in the suburbs and have no idea about it. But if you lived down near the inner city where we did and had these programs in this church that was engaged in this kind of way, what you found out was that there were just a whole lot of people, in fact, multiple generations within a family that had never had a job and never seen anybody who had succeeded and had no idea about responsibility or structure or anything like that. And it didn't take much thinking to look at that and say, if we don't do something to at least keep these people at some modicum of kind of stability or capability, some way they're going to come after us, or they're going to come after the system, or they're going to cause us all other problems. I mean, it was like having a member of your family that had a real problem and, was not able to deal with life very well. And you just felt a sense that you needed to help them, because if you didn't help them, who else was going to? Well, that's where I was. I put a great deal of time into Democrats, into Democratic politics, and gave it hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Democrats. And it was just, I was serious about all of this kind of stuff. Ended up running a presidential campaign for, Gary Hart, and being one of the principals. Small handful of guys who were doing that. And that's because I believed in all this stuff. And it was a time when, like I say, there was clarity about how the system kind of worked. There was a predictability to the whole system. The changes were on the margins, and the things were, they were going somewhere else, but they were going somewhere else slowly, right? And so you could adjust to it and adapt to it. And let me tell you, when you get involved in politics, and this just parachuted, it just dropped into my lap. I really was not interested in this, but I got driven into this space that was very strange to me and very unusual, that was populated by all of these people from other areas of the social structure and the humanity and everything else that I really didn't spend much time with, but they were involved and interested in the political process. And I ended up being exposed to them. It was a little bit like, going to college and suddenly you find out all these other people, or the Navy is the best example. And you go and you find out there are all these other folks and they didn't ever went to church, and they never did this, and they never, and it was, it's this expansion, this expanded awareness kind of thing. And that's what happened when I got into Chicago. So, for the first time in my life, I had friends who were gay, nice guys, nobody was hassling anybody. It was the beginning of AIDS. And so, I remember, the emergence of that and the concerns they all had, and how it ravaged their community. And, we had gay folks at our church, no problem. Everybody was getting along with everybody else, and it was not an issue. Nobody was trying to hustle anybody else. Nobody was trying to tell you that you had to believe, they were outside where I came from. They were all trying to tell you that you had to believe the way they believed, but not where I was living, in the direction that I was going. Everybody was getting along. It was, and we had enough kind of things to do in order to make life better for all of us than to sit around and bitch and moan about, somebody who was wearing a shirt that I didn't like or something. I don't know. And so let me tell you, I went to the I led the delegation from Illinois to the Democratic National Convention. And I ran around all over in Washington, and the House and the Senate and the White House and stuff. And, I believed all of that stuff, and I resonated with it. And I thought that it was the best way to do, I wasn't naive, because you find out really quickly that the system is really flawed. My friend Robert David Steele used to talk about the CIA by saying that there's a whole lot of good people in a really flawed system over there. Well, that's the situation writ large. Certainly, as it's related to government, and you could probably make the case in business and other places as well, academia for sure. That there are a lot of good people in there, but the structure of the system kind of mitigates, their and constrains their best interests or their best feelings and objectives. I mean, it certainly was the case once you get in the middle of the political situation, then you figure out, it's all about compromise. I mean, I grew up and I knew what was right and what was wrong. There was no ambiguity about that. They had told me very clearly what was right and what was wrong. And, if you went to movies or you drank wine or you played cards or, you're going to hell. That was wrong. And so it was really clear to me, clearly, I had migrated away from that. There's another set of stories about what the Navy did to me and what they exposed me to. And, but nevertheless, there was this kind of clarity about what was right and wrong. And then I got to Chicago and got involved in Chicago politics. And let me tell you something. There is no right and wrong. It's all wrong. And then you have to make decisions about which wrong thing do you want to support or you don't want to support. And it was just torqued the inside of me because it was this kind of notion of, what was, truth and what was rightness and all of this business that I'd been taught. And yet there was no other game in town. And I was in a position of responsibility and I had to make decisions. And here I am running around with the mayor of Chicago and, the head of the city council and, and all these greasy guys. But that's what I had to do. And so it was really interesting to figure out that there was a space that you could operate in that was that you had to operate in that was really not clear in the way that it had been made very obvious to me that it's the way I was supposed to live and so on. And one of the kind of nicest things I did, one of my first jobs I had was just horrible. This guy was loony that I worked for, and I was right up to the edge. He was going to either fire me or I was going to quit. And the night, and I quit. And I was on the street for a while and didn't have a job. It was Christmas time. Diane, my wife, was pregnant and they were going to have a kid and I couldn't have a job and she was going to have to quit. And, somebody comes up to me, my friend come up to me and said, "You need a part-time job?" I said, "Yes, I do." And he says, "There's opening to be a Santa Claus in the mall up here at Randhurst in the suburb of Chicago. Would you like to be a Santa Claus for Christmas?" I was a Santa Claus for Christmas. That was an interesting experience too. But anyway, the point is I was put into these strange kind of places. And then I finally, after sending out 150 resumes, I got a one bite on a job to be the assistant to the president of a manufacturing company. And that went all right for a while. And then he wanted me to lie. And I didn't know, I don't lie. And it was just eating my guts out. So I go over one night to dinner with a guy who happens to be the neighbor of the pastor where we lived. And he was just, a business guy he was an industrial designer and doing consulting work and stuff. And I sitting down there on the floor in his living room listening to music because he was really into jazz and other kinds of things. And I was telling him about my situation with this guy I was working for, and he was wanting me to lie. And Dick Latham said to me, "Come over and work for me." He says, "I'll give you a job." He said, "If it doesn't work out, I'll help you find another one." It was the most humane and loving and kind and compassionate thing I think that anyone has ever done to me at that time. It was so profoundly important. And it again torqued me because I kept saying to myself, but he isn't a Christian. How can he do this? How can he have these? How can he act like that? How can he treat me like that? If he isn't a Christian, because only the Christians have these morals, right? And all this stuff. And so I'm constantly getting driven away from this stuff that I've been taught all of my life, early life. And I was suddenly finding out that things were not white and black and white. They were kind of gray. There was a whole lot of gray in there. And that the images and the concepts that I had about people, sometimes just turned out to be really, really wrong. And then that just calls into question all of the underlying principles, the support kind of logic that's underneath it all. And so I, all of these things kind of drove me to kind of embrace and supported in one way or another the whole idea of being a Democrat and the principles of the then Democrat Party. And I got into the business of thinking about the future, and so that's an integrated, discipline. If you're any good at it, it certainly is. And you got to look at everything, all kinds of things, and how they all work together and how they make kind of sense. And so you can, and what you're looking for is trends, right? Because you're trying to see about how things might show up in the future. So when I first got into this business, it was not volatile. There was stuff going on and wars and stupid things and little George Bush and all that kind of stuff. But it was, they were ripples on a general kind of trajectory into the future. Everything, the essence, the principles that I'd grown up with were the same. Men were men, women were women, that kind of stuff. And you knew how the whole thing kind of worked, and you worked around the edges. You did the edges, and the whole objective and the whole approach to kind of life was to work around the edges and make the edges bigger, because you weren't going to be able to change it at the structure, at the fundamentals at all. I mean, that was obvious because it was on this kind of trajectory, and it was all kind of integrated and put all together and interdependent and so on. And it was very large and very complex. And then out of the freaking blue, this thing started going sideways. And if you spend any amount of time kind of thinking about how the system works and being exposed, as I was, to many different components and aspects of the system and the complexity of the system, what you know is that it is really hard to turn this freaking ship and send it off in another direction, in a dramatically different direction. There are so much inertia and stuff that is trying to keep this thing going pretty much the same kind of way. I mean, you're watching it in politics and national politics now, and how they're fighting Trump because they want just to go the way they were going. He's a wrench in the middle of the works of this whole thing, and then it causing them all kinds of problems. And that's what the situation. But then it started to change, and it really started to change in a hurry. And I stood up and said, I, you know, in the Pentagon and all kinds of places where I used to go around giving talks, I figure I've probably given about 350 talks all over the world. And I was saying, where in the world did the legalization of marijuana come from? And where did same-sex marriage come from? Because boom, it just showed up. And all of a sudden, in a just very short period of time, 2 years, something like that, these ideas that had no purchase, they had no, traction, were suddenly uh, arising into the middle of the discussion. And I knew enough about how this system works and how the media works and who controls the media and everything to know that you don't get a change like that that's driven by the media, where you get this over and over and over repeating of the same kind of things that just drive itself into the minds of the American people. That doesn't happen by chance. That's not just trendy. It's not just an idea whose time has come. No, this is being orchestrated. I mean, there's no way in the world that you'd suddenly change the 300 million people who generally think about the same thing, and in a relatively short period of time, you suddenly just turn this thing on. And so then you start saying, so why, and what's the purpose, and what they're trying to do? I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to say, what's the legalization of marijuana about? And you can work this thing 16 different ways. Is it about taxes? Is it about, whatever it is? What are they trying to put in place with the legalization of marijuana, because they see something coming and they're trying to position this such that it plays the kind of salutary role that, in the terms of the society, that they want at some point in the future. And when I say they, there absolutely is a they. And again, if you spend much time running around at any type of senior or important kind of level in the system, it's really quite obvious that there is a they somewhere. Somehow this thing is all organized. And then it started to accelerate, and it started to move into spaces where it obviously had been planned and orchestrated, and it was a strategy that was being executed, and it was being done in schools and universities and things. And there were just little bits that would show up every once in a while about how, the people were teachers and professors and other things were introducing these new new ideas into the space and so on. And it was real easy sitting out here in West Virginia, or some, any number of places probably to continue your life and carry on and see a little bit of it at the side and not realize that there was something really profound and significant that was being orchestrated and systematically being driven into the system to change for a purpose, to change the essence of society, American society, in dramatic and fundamental kind of ways. And the you know, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this, but I believe that this whole situation that we live in now has been planned and systematically organized for decades, for many decades. They've put fluoride in the water. They've put chemtrails and crap in the air. They've put glyphosate in our food. They've put subliminal messages into the televisions and the internet and stuff to get your mind to go another way. It just goes on and on and on. And that kind of stuff does not happen randomly. And now you've got AI coming along and trying to know what the truth and what's real is now is just going to get harder and harder and harder. And so you look at this kind of trend, which is trying to control and suppress humanity going forward and doing it systematically, trying to get you all to get shots so that you got your DNA changes. And, all of these things are all, if you look at them in this integrated kind of way, they're all part of this very sophisticated and impressively executed kind of effort that is going in this one kind of direction. And that direction is about breaking up our society and decreasing the coherence and therefore the predictability. What they really don't want is to be able to have people on the streets, demonstrating against whatever it is that they're trying to do. So everything they're trying to do is to break up the cohesion of the society, both in terms of families and in terms of your health and in terms of education and so on. I'm enough of a conspiracy theorist, I guess, to believe that the idea that you could get huge numbers of people who had gone to college and you'd given them seemingly cheap loans to go to college, and then you had them for the rest of your life because they could never pay off the loans. That doesn't just happen randomly. It's not just a local bank that decides they're going to be nice to college students or something. This is all organized and structured in a way, and all of the pieces are like puzzle pieces that come together and push in the same kind of direction. And so it's been very interesting in the context of kind of that perspective to look at what's happening now, and in particularly in terms of this whole woke business. Because what is at the core and at the base of all of these major kind of changes and social changes that they're trying to push is not cohesion, not bringing people together, not loving each other, if you will, or trying to find common objectives and common direction. It's about breaking the system up and doing it in a very systematic way. It's the whole idea of a divide and conquer kind of thing. And if you can, and it's the, sometimes I think about it and I said, this is really stupid. We all kind of got along there for quite a while and nobody was fighting anybody and there wasn't all this kind of stuff. Sure, there were problems and things needed to be changed and there were a whole lot of us that were trying to change things and make them better, but there wasn't this, it wasn't up here way in your face kind of all the time kind of stuff that was trying to fragment everybody from everybody. And that's what's happening now, is that that with all of this stuff like Black Lives Matter and critical race theory and all these kinds of things, is that at their lowest level, what they're trying to do is they were trying to fragment the system rather than bring people together. What they're trying to say is, however they say it, I'm special, you're not, I'm this, I'm different, I'm whatever. And they're trying to fragment the system into pieces. And if it gets fragmented, then you can control, if you're from the outside, you can control it, and they never get their act together to kind of fight the deep state or the man or whoever it, however you visualize this or think about it. The whole business of and where I'm going with this is that what you've got, what's happening here is at the most kind of fundamental structural level of who we are. When you're trying to say that 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-old kids can make a decision about whether they want to be a man or a woman, as though a kid that age has even the mental capacity to be able to do that. I mean, I was screwed up enough in high school about who I was and what I was trying to do to know that trying to go to some kid in grade school or some say, do you want to be somebody other than what you look like? I mean, it's ludicrous. But so you say, so what are they doing? Why are they trying to do this? What is this about? And how are they doing this? Well, the interesting thing, I mean, this is obviously a very large and complicated kind of system process, because what they have done is, and this is in Cliff High had this term he called it. He said that they weaponized compassion. And I think that's absolutely right. What they've done is they've taken advantage of guys like me that came out of, and this is why I got out of the Democrat, call myself an independent now, that because, I grew up with this compassion for people who, had less than I did or needed help, I guess is what it best way. And so I've tried to help people, a lot of people, different places. And the powers that be, who have spent a lot of money funding psychologists and sociologists and all these kinds of programs in college, universities and stuff around, to try to figure out just how it is that you manipulate now you affect it. They have figured out that they can essentially weaponize compassion, that they can appeal to the goodness inside of humans, that they want to help other people who are supposedly in trouble or in problems. And then they've set up this situation where all of these people they're breaking the society all up, and 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 they've convinced good and well-meaning people that this business of having 35 different genders or whatever the things are and all that kind of stuff is a natural thing, and that we should really help these people because they really need help. And I have no doubt that there's some of them that really need help, and but what you need to do is look bigger. You need to back away from this whole thing and say, what is it that's really happening here? I mean, I've had a bit of this discussion with a friend of mine who's a therapist, and I watched her eyes changed when I started to raise this, because she was in the business of helping people, and there are a lot of hurting people in this kind of space. And so the notion that you might not want to be compassionate for these folks was a kind of a localized thing, and it was devoid and divorced from the larger kind of notion of where this is going and what's being done to us as human beings in America in general, and Americans in particular. It's and so there's a fascinating kind of balance that it seems to me that we need to have as we go into this space. That on one hand, we all need to be compassionate. We need to help people. I mean, we're in a community, we live together, we're all connected to each other. We absolutely need to do that. But on the other hand, you need to understand if this kind of natural notion for love and compassion is being uh, orchestrated, is being weaponized to use us against, for these objectives that are ultimately about breaking our social system apart. Uh, this is I'm going to stop now. But this is a bad time to stop, because this thing where this goes and what it means is much, much bigger than that. But the amount of time that's available to us right now is such that I just need to raise this issue that suggests that there is something really much bigger and much more profound that is being orchestrated here. And it has to do with tearing apart and decomposing the solidity and the social structure that we have as humans in general, and particularly in the developed world. And they are appealing to our natural instincts and the best part of who we are to help facilitate and make that happen. And so there's this, like I say, there's this tension it's going to be part of this process as we moved into this new world and go to say, how do we do this? You can't be mean, and you need to be loving, but at the same time, you need to have a bigger idea about where is this taking us? Is this taking us off some kind of cliff where there's no stability within the system? The whole thing comes apart. And so I hope maybe that helps kind of provoke you to think a little bit. And I'm sure some of you will send me nasty notes, but that's okay. You can do that as well. So thank you.